I have been repeatedly convinced of the incredible tactical opportunities offered by the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons weapon list. Why repeatedly? First, because weapons have at least 4 properties that make each interesting and unique. And second, because I have not found a single place that explains all of them, and so I was introduced to each of them individually, meaning that each property alone was enough to excite me. However, I do hope that with this video I can bring it all into one place and make it easier for my players and others to understand the implications of these weapon properties. I'm going to start with one that's pretty easy to grasp, but also very impactful in creating different roles for different weapons. Armor class to hit modifiers. The idea here is that different weapons perform better or worse against various types of armor. Let's look at a few extreme examples to see how large this impact can be. I like the Bardiche as an example. It's not going to highlight, is it? There it is. The Bardiche is an example because we can see that it is even worse against heavy armor than average, while against unarmored opponents it has extreme bonuses, right? So it's good for shredding unarmored peasants, ogres, things like that. The Bec de Corbin is also interesting. It gets bonuses at the other end, right? So it's offsetting heavy armor and pretty vanilla against people with low armor. The fist is interesting. It's very similar to the Bardiche, except even more extreme, right? No armor, like mages, it's getting huge bonuses. And then against things like plate armor, it's almost completely ineffective. It's what makes monks the mage slayer. The two-handed sword is an interesting one. If we come down to the two-handed sword here, you can see huge bonuses in the mid ranges where you're going to find your orcs and your kobolds and your goblins, and pretty good bonuses down low, right? Just as good as the Bec de Corbin. It's a pretty good all around weapon, but we'll see that it's got some problems later. The Bastard Sword is actually interesting. The Bastard Sword, pretty good in that mid range, right? Kind of like a discount two-handed sword there. But if you wield it one-handed, you can treat it as a long sword and get these bonuses against low armor classes, making it easier to hit, again, the unarmored things like mages and ogres. Um, AC adjustments for ranged weapons are interesting as well. So here's our ranged weapons. One interesting comparison is the longbow versus the short bow. They look pretty similar at the high end, or at the high AC end, where you've got unarmored creatures. The longbow's a little bit better, and it starts to get better and better. And then way down here at heavily armored things, the short bow looks pretty sad, while the longbow is still fairly effective. And so that's one thing that really sets fighters and assassins too, I guess, apart from like thieves and scouts, that they can use that longbow and really remain effective across all the armor classes. So that's something that really differentiates all of the weapons. The next thing is the damage. The next property, I don't even count it in my 4 because it's simple and unsurprising, but it does matter in weapon selection. And since we're already talking about how weapons interact with enemy traits, it makes sense here. And that is the damage die. So looking at the damage die here, it's hardly worth mentioning because you know already, if you've played Dungeons and Dragons at all, that different weapons do different damage. But it is interesting that some of these have pretty extreme differences depending on the size of the enemy. For example, the two-handed sword, its damage is pretty normal against small and medium creatures, but against large creatures it goes, off the charts. Same with the heavy lance. Um, Not aware of any that, a few are better against medium creatures like the battle axe. And so that's an interesting consideration. Right? If you're picking a weapon for big enemies, you want to pick a heavy weapon. Right? This is another place where the bastard sword shines. Its damage gets well above the long sword against those larger enemies, but against a normal enemy, you might want to wield it one-handed, or be okay with wielding it one-handed so you can use a shield. Interesting comparison. Speed factor is the next one I'm going to talk about. Speed factor is interesting. It's the last weapon property that I really understood. And I have to admit a few things up front. And the first is that I don't love exactly how it's used in the DMG. I've got that up on the page here. And so I homebrew it heavily, but we'll talk about that later. The second is that the strategic factor that determines your optimal weapon speed is the enemy's weapon speed. So a player would have to be really paying attention to choose a fast weapon to hit an advantageous breakpoint against a slow weapon, or off of a slow weapon when they see an enemy with a fast one. For many players, I think the limit to which they interact with this mechanic might be remembering to ask the DM if their speed factor gets them a second attack. Of course, I bet they start paying more attention to it if the DM repeatedly allows enemies with fast weapons to get the advantage against their slow weapons. But that brings us to the question of how often this comes up. According to the DMG, speed factor only comes up when there is a tie in initiative. So 1 round in 6, sort of. That makes a lot of sense when the speed factor is only breaking the initiative tie, but at larger differences in speed factor, the faster weapon can actually gain extra attacks. This seems to require an initiative tie as written. So if I have a dagger, speed factor 2, against a pike with speed factor 13, we can show those on here if I can. So if we have the dagger with speed factor 2 and the pike with speed factor 13, then the dagger can get 3 attacks to his 1 attack, to the pike's 1 attack, but only if you tie an initiative, not if you win initiative, not if you lose initiative. But of course, I always struggle when I talk about initiative because I find the DMG initiative either incomplete or undesirable. I use Rick Stump's initiative from Far Realms in my game, and I should make a video explaining how that works sometime. But I like it a lot. The way it handles characters with multiple attacks is to give the characters their second and third attacks on later segments. So 3 segments later for 2 attacks, and 2 segments later for 3 attacks. Now, how I handle extreme speed factor differences is that if combatants engaged in melee have rolled the same initiative, their attacks land from lowest speed factor to highest speed factor. And for the sake of speed factor producing additional attacks, the combatant's speed factor is compared only to the lowest opposing speed factor within melee range. So if you have a short sword, where's that short sword, with a speed factor of 3, and you're fighting 2 guys with pikes with 13, but one of your opponents has a scimitar with a speed factor of 4, you'd still get to go first, but you'd be compared against that scimitar, so you wouldn't get any extra attacks. But if you're 5 lower, so say you didn't have that scimitar, there was just the 2 pikes, you're 5 lower, that gets you a second attack. Well, you're actually 10 lower, so if you're 10 lower, you get the third attack. And if you get the 2 attacks, I do the same thing that Farm Realms does by default. The second attack is 3 segments after the first, and it still wins initiative ties. And if you get 3 attacks, that the second is only 2 segments after the first, and the third is 4 segments after the first. But on that third attack, you lose initiative ties. So by way of example, our dagger with the speed factor of 2, fighting against our pikes with a speed factor of 13, you're entitled to 3 attacks, assuming you started engaged. And if the dagger had an initiative of 1 and the opponent had an initiative of 5, that dagger would be able to roll attacks on a 1 and a 3 and on segment 5, right? 1, and then 2 segments later, segment 3, 4 segments later, segment 5. But on segment 5, since the pike rolled a 5 initiative, the pike would attack first, since that's the dagger's third attack. And of course, keep in mind that all of these extra attacks are only possible for combatants that are engaged in melee at the start of the round and remain engaged during the round. If you break off and come back around on an opponent with a slower weapon, you don't get those extra attacks. But that is far more than I intended to say about a single property, and I really do need to do a video about Far Realms Combat Initiative. And now we can kind of move off of weapon properties that present strategic choices in response to enemy characteristics, and onto weapon properties that allow players to strategically interact with the terrain. So let's talk about length. You can see the length listed in this column here. The length of a weapon has a number of effects. I said we were going to move off of how we interact with the enemy, but the first that I want to talk about is how length interacts with the enemy. Interacts with enemy weapon length. While speed factor is breaking initiative ties when you're already in melee, weapon length is the determining factor for combatants closing and attacking in the same segment. And the longer weapon gets the first attack. And so that's one of these advantages of having a heavy lance, is that you are going to reach the enemy before their short lance if you're charging at each other, or their medium lance. But the way it affects terrain is that it kind of determines the extent to which you can block a corridor. So let's see if I can illustrate this. So if you have this 10-foot wide corridor that you are defending, that didn't lift correct. Oh man, that was just awful. Okay, you have this 10-foot wide corridor that you're trying to hold, while 3 people, even with fists, can prevent passage down this corridor. Each person takes 3 feet of space to stand in that corridor. One person with a 6-foot long two-handed sword, standing in the middle, he can reach both sides because his two-handed sword is 6 feet long, and so he can hold the whole passage by himself, right? By offending anyone who attempts to pass by him. And then the other advantage of that of long weapons, or the other effect that they have, is that while only 3 guys can fit in this corridor, and we'll say they have swords and shields, they could have friends behind them with longer weapons, like spears maybe, who are also able to engage, even though they can't squeeze up to that front line because they have long weapons. They can reach over their allies. So that's weapon length. The last property, and one that I ignored for a long time because it didn't make sense to me, is the space required. I had kind of assumed that it was the space that you needed to have behind you, but that didn't make a lot of sense given some of the numbers that I was looking at. And so now that I understand, the space required is the space that a weapon, if length is the maximum space that a weapon can fill a corridor, then space required is the minimum that a weapon can take filling a corridor. So while our spear has a length of maybe 6 feet, and so the guy with the spear can offend the whole width of the corridor, it has a space required of only 1 foot, which means he only needs a 1-foot corridor to operate, right? Whereas our two-handed sword wouldn't be able to operate in a corridor less than 6 feet wide at all because he has a 6-foot wide space required. Similarly, if you have the 2 fighters, 2 fighters with two-handed swords, they have a space required of 6 feet. So only the 1 fighter with a two-handed sword would be able to fight in the front. The other fighter would have to be behind because there's only a 10-foot wide space, and 12 feet is more than 10 feet. You get it, right? But if one of these guys in this 10-foot corridor had a two-handed sword that was 6 feet wide, and the second guy had a battle axe, the battle axe only has a space required of 4 feet, and so those 2 could stand side by side in the corridor and defend that front. And I may have misspoken. I said that the second swordsman would have to stand behind. The second swordsman can't engage at all, right? Because this guy's already using 6 feet of the corridor, and he would need another 6 feet of corridor and able to fight. The other implication is that so we had our three guys with short swords in the front here. They have a space required of 3, so they're really only taking up 3 feet of that corridor with respect to their allies being able to engage using space required. While they're blocking anyone from being able to pass with just their bodies, they are able to. The spearmen are able to fight from behind because they also have a 1 foot space required. And we've only used 6 of our feet so far, so we could actually have some pikemen in the back as well with even longer weapons, and that also has a space required of 1 foot. And so all 9 of these people only adds up to 9 feet of the corridor used. And so that covers space required. There's a few things that I haven't talked about, like on the ranged weapons. I didn't talk about their range or their fire rate. Those are interesting, right? A lot of ranged weapons get a second attack. Ranges can be important. But like damage dice, that's pretty self-explanatory. I think you understand. Some of the weapons have really interesting properties, like the Spetum with its disarm ability, um, or setting against a charge with spears and pikes, or getting bonuses from charges with lances. But all of those are pretty special cases. And of course, encumbrance is an important thing to consider as well. Some of these weapons can be extremely heavy. It's on this page here. The two-handed sword, for example, being 25 pounds of your encumbrance, right? And so not necessarily something that you want to be carrying around if you're not going to be able to use it in the dungeon. So between these 4 or so weapon properties, we can see a wide variety of weapons becoming viable in various situations. And this is really the strength of the fighter class. Without this variety of weapons, you kind of wonder why bother with the fighter, right? He doesn't hit that much harder than the cleric, and he doesn't get the healing, and he's missing so many options. It seems like, but when you understand how different all of the weapons are, the fighter looks a lot more appealing. Um, and they get more weapon proficiencies, right? So you can pick some of these very powerful weapons that do special things, like the longbow and the two-handed sword, but also you can pick more weapons to be able to be suited to any situation that you encounter. And it gives you interesting questions. Do you take the two-handed sword for sheer damage output, give up a shield, and risk finding tight spaces you can't use it in, or fast opponents that will get extra attacks against you? Not to mention that even in wide corridors, you're going to prevent having very many allies fight beside you. Or do you take a spear or something that requires very little space to be able to operate in tight spaces in the dungeon? There's really a lot of choices that the fighter could make, and that is why I love the weapons in first edition. Thanks for watching.